And a U.S Iranian deal taking shape to revive Iran's 2015 nuclear agreement with world powers lays out phases of mutual steps to bring both sides back into full compliance. Envoys from Iran, Russia, China, Britain, France, Germany, the European Union and the United States are still negotiating details of the draft accord. Amid Western warnings that time is running out before the original deal becomes obsolete, delegates say much of the text is settled, but some thorny issues remain. The broad objective is to return to the original bargain of lifting sanctions against Iran, including ones that have slashed its crucial oil sales. That's in exchange for restrictions on its nuclear activities that extend the time it would need to produce enough enriched uranium for an atomic bomb if it chose to. Iran has breached many of those restrictions and pushed well beyond them in response to the U.S. withdrawal from the deal in 2018 and its reimposition of sanctions under then President Donald Trump. Right, to talk a little bit more about what is happening in Austria, Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi is another member of the Iran team in Vienna. He says the agreement could be reached within days. A very good evening to you, Professor. Good to talk to you once again. So tell us about the reason for your optimism.
Well, over the past few weeks, there has been a significant amount of progress, despite the fact that the Americans and the Europeans have constantly been dragging their feet. They were hoping that they could get new concessions from Iran that go beyond the JCPOA or the nuclear deal. And the Iranians were telling them from day one that that would be useless, a useless endeavor. Gradually, they came to their senses. They began to move towards recognizing the need for an agreement. So with regards to many of the issues, we now see the different sides, especially the two sides, Western countries and the United States, coming to an agreement. But there are still issues that have yet to be resolved, and the Iranians are waiting for the United States and the Europeans to make the decisions necessary for an agreement to take place. If they hadn't dragged their feet, and if they would stop dragging their feet now, we would have a deal. We would have already had a deal. Indeed, right now, one of the European countries is as we speak, continuing to insist to include issues that have nothing to do with the nuclear deal in the negotiations, and the Iranians are rejecting that, and they're saying that these are just delaying progress. But there is an opportunity, as I said earlier, that a deal is at hand, but we have to see if the Americans and the Europeans are ready for it.
Are you able to share with us which country is insisting on this?
I think for the sake of the negotiations and in order to prevent any difficulties, unnecessary difficulties from arising, I'll refrain from doing so, but maybe later on we could discuss that in a different program.
All right, I'm going to hold you to that, the behind-the-scenes talks. But would you say general goodwill exists among those who are seated at the table if we're saying progress is being made and we're talking about this happening in phased-in timetables?
Well, we can't say that Western countries have shown good faith, because over the past few years, it's been these countries that have violated the deal, that have torn up the deal. In 2015, this deal was negotiated in a hotel 5 minutes away from where I am right now. And from day one, the Americans violated the deal, and so did the Europeans, literally from day one, both openly and covertly. Openly, they imposed new sanctions, which violated the deal, and behind closed doors, The Americans were telling banks through the Treasury Department, financial institutions, insurance companies, shipping companies, you name it, not to cooperate with Iran. And that was a clear violation of the deal. So under Obama, the United States was being utterly dishonest. They were continuing to put pressure on ordinary Iranians, whereas the Iranians were in full compliance. The same was true with the Europeans. And then under Trump, as we know, the Americans tore up the deal and the Europeans followed suit in effect. They didn't leave the deal, but they effectively violated all of their commitments under orders from Washington. And as we speak, the United States under Biden continues to impose maximum pressure sanctions. The Biden regime is trying to hurt Iranians as much as possible. And therefore, we don't see any good faith among the Europeans or the Americans. Even at the negotiating table, they're constantly dragging their feet. They're constantly trying to include issues, as I mentioned earlier, that have nothing to do with the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. But the Iranians have been steadfast, and the Iranians have said that we will not give you new concessions. The nuclear deal was the deal. Iran gave concessions there, and there's no need for further concessions. So, right. And the Iranians are also being much more careful this time around in the negotiations than in 2015 to prevent the Americans from cheating Iran as they did back then.
So what specifically?
The Iranians are insisting. Yes, well, specifically, in 2015, there was a verification process for Iranian actions with regards to its nuclear program, where the International Atomic Energy Agency would monitor and see if Iran is complying by its commitments in the deal. But there was no verification process for the Americans and the Europeans. And this time around, the Iranians have said we must have a very carefully constructed verification process so that we don't, so what happened in 2015 is not repeated, where the Americans impose new sanctions or the Europeans impose new sanctions, or the Americans behind closed doors threaten banks not to work with Iran and so on. So this time around, the Iranians are making sure that the Western countries can't cheat the country. And with regards to guarantees as well, so that the Americans just don't tear up the agreement like last time round. The Iranians want guarantees, assurances. If the Americans and the Europeans can't give those assurances, then those assurances must be created inside Iran, which I can't go into detail right now, but the Iranians will demand that certain let's say the conditions are that their conditions are met in a way that if the Americans and the Europeans violate the deal, it will come at a heavy cost. So the Iranians are saying if you can't give us assurances, then those assurances must exist inside Iran, which if the deal is signed, when the deal is signed, I could again explain in greater detail what it means to have those assurances existing inside the country.
All right. So would Iran, as we speak at this point, agree to go back to below 5% levels of enrichment of uranium? I know when you and I last spoke, the issue of political prisoners was very high on its agenda, and of course the releasing of Iranian money.
Well, the issue of prisoners is not directly related to the negotiations. And we always hear about Western countries speaking about the prisoners in Iran. And these were people who broke the law in Iran, who were working in cooperation with foreign entities. But in any case, none of these Western media outlets speak of the tens of Iranians and non-Iranians that have been arrested by Western governments, in particular the United States, because they were breaking the sanctions, breaking illegal sanctions. So some people are arrested in third countries under orders from the United States. Some are in jail. Some are being persecuted. Yet you don't hear about any of these people in the Western media because Iranian prisoners obviously have no value. But the issue of prisoners is something that has to be negotiated because the Iranians want these innocent people that the United States and its allies have arrested to be freed. But Iran, with regards to the negotiations themselves, Iran is willing to go back to 2015. And we have to remember that the only side that implemented the deal was Iran. And even when the Americans violated the deal and later left the deal, the Iranians continued to implement the deal in full. But you wouldn't think that if you heard this from Western media outlets or Western think tanks or Western elites. So Iran is willing to go back if all of the sanctions, if the sanctions are removed, the sanctions, the maximum pressure sanctions that are directed to harm women and children, if those are removed, if the verification process that Iran demands is approved, and if the assurances, or if assurances that suffice for Iran are put in place, then the Iranians are willing to go back to 2015. But Iran this time around, because the Americans and the Europeans have shown absolutely no goodwill in the past nor in the present, the Iranians are being very careful at the negotiating table to make sure the other side doesn't cheat again.
So if we're talking about the deal being signed and agreement on some of the stickler issues, I believe the text in some of those agreements is a source of contention. What would be those phases and when, including, I believe, the Iranian oil sanctions?
Well, I don't want to go into details because, and some of the issues that we are hearing in the media, for example, there's a Reuters report that came out. It is not at all accurate. It's misinformation. But what I can say is that under the JCPOA and under any agreement to revive the JCPOA, the United States and the Europeans can no longer impede Iranian oil sales or any business conducted inside Iran. And therefore, that would mean that they cannot harass parties that want to purchase Iranian oil. They cannot prevent banks from cooperating with Iran for transactions. They cannot prevent or harass insurance companies or shipping companies or airlines from cooperating with Iran. And that verification process that the Iranians are insisting on creating is to make sure that this harassment is non-existent. So what we will be seeing if there is a deal is the complete normalization of Iranian trade and businesses. But what I think we have learned over the past 3-4 years is that the maximum pressure campaign has utterly failed. And the Europeans and the Americans have been unable to bring the Iranians to their knees. We see that Iran's position regionally is stronger. We see that Iran's peaceful nuclear program is more developed. And all that the Americans and the Europeans have done is killed innocent Iranians and created greater hostility and hatred towards Western countries for these crimes against humanity. And especially at a time when Europe and the United States are failing in their confrontation with China, they're failing in their confrontation with Russia, and they have so many different problems at home, the United States, the internal divisions, the economic problems. They are in no position really to continue this antagonism towards Iran. So the Iranians are saying it's time to return for the Americans and the Europeans to come back to the negotiating table. But this time round, they have to abide by their commitments. Otherwise, the Iranians are not going to go back to 2015.
And I'd imagine then there would have to be an acceptance that there is a possibility of peaceful coexistence. And as some say, that even though Iran has a strong army, that it being a threat is being overstated.
Well, the Americans and the Europeans have surrounded Iran with military bases. So who is threatening whom. And the Americans and the Europeans have destroyed so much of Syria with their dirty war. They supported Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria alongside regional countries and Turkey and the Israeli regime. They're committing genocide in Yemen. Right now, they're stealing Afghanistan's money and forcing the country towards starvation. They've destroyed Libya, a country that many in South Africa know quite well. They're trying to crush Venezuela and Cuba. So, the countries that threaten the rest of the world are NATO countries. And the irony, of course, is that NATO is so upset about Russia and Russian forces inside Russia near Ukraine, yet they seem to forget that Russian forces are in Russia, but American and European forces, British forces, are surrounding Iran with military bases, and it's not on their own territory. It's in the Emirates, it's in Qatar, it's in Bahrain, they're in Saudi Arabia, they're everywhere. The only country where they've withdrawn is Afghanistan because they fled the country. So who is threatening whom? Who has sanctioned whom? Who has, the Americans have murdered senior Iranian officials. And so, when one looks at the Western media, you'd think that it's Iran that's carrying out the aggression. But in reality, the truth is the exact opposite. But that's something that you won't hear in Western media or in Western think tanks or among Western officials.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi. Of course, we will be speaking to him as the talks continue. He's a member of the Iran team in Vienna in those negotiations. Agreement could be reached within days, he says.